The first thing the Ottoman warriors noticed was not the fire, it was the silence. Even after weeks of cannon blasts, collapsing stone walls, and the endless roar of battle outside the fortress of Malta, the silence waiting inside those blackened corridors felt wrong. Entire sections of the stronghold still burned beneath the night sky, sending smoke rolling through narrow passageways, lit only by glowing embers and flickering torchlight. Yet there were no voices, no final resistance, no desperate cries echoing through the fortress halls. Just abandoned armor standing motionless in the dark like shadows frozen in time. One janissary later claimed he thought the fortress itself had died before they ever entered it. In the summer of 1565, Malta had become one of the most brutal siege battlegrounds in the Mediterranean world. For months, the Ottoman Empire had thrown wave after wave of elite warriors against the island's defenses, determined to crush the Knights Hospitaller and seize control of one of the most strategic strongholds in Europe. Thousands of men crossed burning stone walls under relentless heat that climbed well above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Water ran low. Smoke covered the coastline for days at a time. Entire batteries of cannons shook the earth from sunrise until deep into the night. And yet the fortress still refused to fall. To the Ottoman soldiers staring up at those walls, Malta no longer looked like a fortress. It looked like something alive, something that simply refused to die. But then, after another devastating assault, the defenders suddenly vanished from entire sections of the stronghold. Ottoman warriors cautiously advanced through shattered gates, expecting close combat around every corner. Instead, they found overturned tables, half-burned banners, cracked helmets and armor left behind in strange places, as if the men wearing them had disappeared moments earlier. One corridor reportedly contained a full suit of steel armor, leaning against a scorched wall with no body nearby, no weapon drawn, and no sign of struggle around it. Even stranger, the fire had not consumed it completely. Parts of the metal still reflected the orange glow of the flames moving through the fortress. For exhausted soldiers who had spent weeks surrounded by death, smoke, exhaustion, and fear, discoveries like this began to feel deeply unsettling. Some believed the defenders had escaped through hidden tunnels beneath the fortress. Others whispered that the Knights of Malta had abandoned wounded men behind during the chaos of the final retreat. But a few Ottoman veterans would later describe something even stranger. They claimed the deeper they moved into the fortress, the more it felt occupied despite being nearly empty. Doors creaked open somewhere ahead, footsteps echoed through smoke-filled corridors, shapes appeared briefly beyond the firelight and vanished again into darkness. Whether these stories were real or simply the minds of exhausted soldiers pushed beyond human limits, no one truly knows. But what the Ottoman warriors discovered inside the burning fortress that night would become one of the most haunting stories of the Great Siege of Malta, because the abandoned armor they found may have belonged to a man who never truly left the fortress at all. And before we continue deeper into the siege, make sure to subscribe and let me know in the comments if you think ancient battlefields can somehow hold on to the memory of the people who fought there. Long before the smoke drifted through those ruined corridors, Malta had already earned a reputation that spread across every major port of the Mediterranean. Sailors spoke of it in taverns from Venice to Constantinople. Merchants crossing open waters whispered about the island the same way soldiers spoke about an enemy they respected but feared. Rising from the sea on steep stone cliffs, Malta stood directly in the path of Ottoman expansion, guarding vital shipping routes like a fortress planted between worlds. To Christian Europe, it was a shield. To the Ottoman Empire, it was an obstacle that refused to move aside. And at the center of it all stood the Knights Hospitaller, a military order hardened by decades of war, exile, and survival. They were not kings or emperors commanding giant armies across continents. They were something stranger. Warriors bound by faith, discipline, and duty, living inside massive stone fortresses designed to survive sieges that would crush ordinary cities. By 1565, many Ottoman commanders believed Malta had become too dangerous to ignore. Ottoman ships moving through the Mediterranean faced constant harassment from the knights based on the island. Raids, captured cargo, intercepted vessels, and attacks on strategic routes slowly turned Malta into a thorn buried deep inside Ottoman ambitions. Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, already one of the most powerful rulers in the world, finally ordered a massive campaign to eliminate that threat permanently. What followed was unlike anything most men in the invasion force had ever experienced. Thousands of Ottoman soldiers crossed the sea, expecting another military victory in a growing empire that already stretched across enormous portions of Europe, Asia, and North Africa. Instead, they encountered walls that seemed built to survive the end of the world itself. The fortress defenses of Malta rose from the rocky coastline like giant cliffs carved into perfect killing zones. Every approach was exposed. Every narrow path leading toward the walls had already been measured by enemy artillery crews waiting above. Even experienced janissaries, considered among the finest warriors of their era, quickly realized this siege would not resemble the open battlefield victories they were used to. The heat alone became unbearable. Summer sunlight reflected off pale stone walls with blinding intensity. Armor trapped heat against the body for hours at a time. Water had to be rationed carefully. Smoke from artillery and burning structures hung over the island almost constantly, mixing with sea air until entire sections of the battlefield disappeared behind gray haze. At night, exhausted soldiers rested beside cannons still warm from firing throughout the day, while engineers worked endlessly to repair trenches and siege positions destroyed by enemy bombardments. Yet despite the endless pressure, the defenders inside Malta refused to collapse. The Knights Hospitaller transformed every damaged wall, broken tower, and ruined courtyard into another defensive position. When outer sections fell, they withdrew deeper into the fortress and continued resisting from behind fresh barricades. Ottoman officers who expected quick victories instead found themselves trapped in a grinding siege where every advance demanded more time, more resources, and more men. Slowly, the campaign stopped feeling like a conquest and started feeling like endurance against something almost impossible to break. And as the weeks dragged on beneath the burning Mediterranean sun, rumors began spreading through Ottoman camps that the fortress itself was changing the men fighting around it. Veterans who entered the siege confident and disciplined now spoke in quieter voices after dark. Some claimed the defenders moved through hidden tunnels beneath the walls. Others believed the knights were preparing one final desperate stand somewhere deep inside the burning stronghold. But no one yet understood that hidden among the smoke, shattered stone, and abandoned relics inside Malta waited a mystery that would outlive the siege itself. By the middle of the siege, the island no longer felt like part of the normal world. Men on both sides had begun measuring time differently, not by days or weeks, but by bombardments, failed assaults, collapsing walls, and the rare moments when smoke finally drifted out toward the sea. The heat remained relentless. Under the Mediterranean sun, stone pathways became almost too hot to touch, while the air inside trenches and defensive positions carried the heavy smell of ash, seawater, sweat, and burned wood. Ottoman engineers worked through the night repairing shattered siege batteries, while janissaries rested beside ruined cannons with dust covering their faces and armor. Across the battlefield, the defenders inside the fortress were suffering just as badly. Supplies were running low. Entire sections of the stronghold had already been reduced to blackened ruins. Churches, towers, storage rooms, and barracks now stood cracked open beneath constant artillery fire. Yet somehow the defenders still held their ground. What shocked many Ottoman veterans was not the resistance itself, but the way the defenders adapted to destruction. Every shattered wall seemed to create another line of defense. Every collapsed hallway became a barricade. Even damaged courtyards turned into narrow choke points, where exhausted knights and soldiers continued resisting hour after hour. One Ottoman officer reportedly wrote that fighting in Malta felt less like attacking a city and more like trying to destroy a mountain, one stone at a time. At night, the siege became even stranger. Fires burned across the island long after sunset, casting orange light against thick smoke clouds rolling over the fortress walls. Ottoman sentries stationed near the front lines sometimes claimed they could hear church bells ringing faintly somewhere inside the ruins, despite many of those buildings already being destroyed. Others reported seeing armored figures moving along damaged ramparts before disappearing behind smoke moments later. Whether these stories were real or simply the imagination of exhausted soldiers slowly wearing down beneath endless stress, no one could say for certain. But the siege was clearly changing the men trapped inside it. The deeper the campaign dragged on, the more discipline gave way to exhaustion and superstition. Water shortages worsened conditions for everyone. Soldiers carried heavy armor beneath temperatures that often climbed beyond 100 degrees Fahrenheit, while smoke from cannon fire made breathing difficult inside enclosed positions. Sleep became almost impossible. Entire nights passed beneath the thunder of artillery, while engineers dug trenches closer to the walls under constant danger from enemy fire above. Food grew scarce in some areas, and sickness began spreading through overcrowded camps exposed to extreme heat for weeks at a time. Yet despite all of this, the fortress still stood. That fact alone began haunting the Ottoman army. Many had entered the campaign believing Malta would fall quickly beneath the weight of one of the largest military operations of the century. Instead, the siege turned into a slow struggle of endurance, where every gain came at enormous cost. Some janissaries reportedly began carrying small religious charms into battle for protection. Others whispered that the defenders inside the fortress no longer fought like ordinary men because they had already accepted death long ago. Meanwhile, inside the ruined stronghold itself, the defenders faced a reality just as desperate. Knights Hospitaller moved through damaged tunnels, carrying supplies through darkness lit only by torches and burning debris. Wounded men rested beside collapsed walls while commanders prepared for the possibility of one final assault that could break the fortress completely. By then, entire sections of Malta looked less like a military stronghold and more like the remains of a civilization slowly collapsing into fire and smoke. And somewhere deep within those damaged corridors, beyond shattered gates and burned stone passageways, something had already been left behind. Something silent. Something abandoned. Something the Ottoman warriors had not yet discovered. The corridor was still warm when the janissaries entered it. Smoke drifted low across the stone floor, twisting through the darkness as embers crackled somewhere deeper inside the ruined fortress. The men moved carefully beneath blackened archways, with torches raised high, expecting another hidden barricade or desperate defenders waiting beyond the next turn. Instead, they found something far stranger. An entire section of the fortress stood completely abandoned. Doors hung partially open. Burned banners swayed gently from the ceiling where heat from nearby fires pushed hot air through the narrow passageways. Pieces of shattered armor lay scattered across the floor beside overturned benches and cracked shields darkened by smoke. Yet what unsettled the Ottoman warriors most was not the destruction. It was the feeling that whoever had been there moments earlier had vanished without warning. One veteran later described the silence inside those halls as heavier than the siege itself. Even after months of warfare, he claimed the emptiness felt unnatural. Torchlight flickered against the walls as the soldiers advanced deeper into the corridor. Then one of them suddenly stopped. Resting beside a scorched stone wall stood a nearly complete suit of armor. Unlike the shattered equipment scattered throughout the fortress, this armor looked carefully placed rather than discarded in panic. A steel breastplate leaned upright against the wall beside a helmet with a deep crack running across its surface. One gauntlet rested on the floor nearby, while a sword remained untouched beside the armor, as if its owner intended to return at any moment. Smoke curled slowly around the metal, reflecting faint orange light from fires still burning elsewhere in the fortress. But there was no sign of the man who wore it. No body. No blood trail leading away. No evidence explaining why the armor had been abandoned there, alone in the darkness. For several moments, nobody moved. The Janissaries simply stared at it in silence, while distant cannon fire echoed outside the fortress walls. By then, many soldiers were already exhausted beyond normal limits. Weeks of relentless heat, little sleep, and constant combat had pushed even experienced warriors close to collapse. Yet something about that armor disturbed them in a way battlefield destruction normally did not. One soldier reportedly whispered that it looked less like abandoned equipment and more like a grave marker left behind for someone who never escaped. Another believed the armor belonged to a high-ranking knight who had removed it while preparing to flee through hidden tunnels beneath the fortress. But others were not so certain. They noticed details that made the discovery even stranger. The sword beside the armor remained clean despite the surrounding destruction. The leather straps holding parts of the armor together appeared partially burned, yet the metal itself had survived the heat remarkably well. Even more unsettling, the floor surrounding the armor showed almost no signs of struggle at all. It was as though the owner had calmly stepped out of the armor and disappeared into smoke moments before the Ottomans arrived. As more soldiers gathered around the corridor, stories immediately began spreading through nearby units. Some claimed hidden defenders still moved through underground passages beneath the fortress walls. Others insisted the knights had staged elaborate false retreats to lure Ottoman warriors deeper inside. Yet despite the rumors, the abandoned armor remained exactly where it had been found, silent and motionless beneath flickering firelight, while smoke drifted endlessly through the ruined corridor. And somewhere beyond those burned halls, deeper inside the shattered fortress, strange sounds still echoed through the darkness, as if the siege itself was not entirely over. At first, the Ottoman soldiers believed the armor belonged to another fallen defender, lost somewhere in the chaos of the siege. After weeks of combat, abandoned weapons and damaged equipment had become common sights across the island. But the longer they remained inside that burned corridor, the more unusual the discovery appeared. One Janissary crouched beside the armor and carefully lifted the cracked helmet into the torchlight. Beneath layers of soot and ash, faint markings still remained visible along the steel. They were not random decorations. They appeared to belong to a knight of significant rank within the defenders of Malta. The edges of the breastplate carried traces of gold detailing darkened by smoke, while the craftsmanship itself looked far finer than ordinary battlefield armor worn by common soldiers. Whoever owned it had not been an inexperienced recruit pulled into the siege. This had likely been a veteran, perhaps even one of the men responsible for organizing the fortress defenses during the worst weeks of the fighting. Yet the greatest mystery remained unanswered. Why had he abandoned it? Ottoman warriors understood the importance of armor better than most. In the brutal close quarters of siege warfare, armor was survival. Men did not simply remove valuable protection and leave it behind unless something had forced them to do so. Some of the soldiers inspecting the corridor believed the knight had been wounded and unable to continue moving through the burning fortress. Others thought he may have stripped off the heavy armor to escape through narrow underground tunnels beneath the walls while fires spread above him. The deeper they studied the scene, the stranger it became. One leather fastening appeared sliced cleanly rather than burned apart by heat. The sword lying beside the wall still rested partly inside its scabbard, as though it had never been drawn during the final moments. Nearby, they discovered a partially burned cloth carrying the faded symbol of the Knights Hospitaller beneath layers of ash. Yet there were no signs of panic around the armor itself. No overturned furniture nearby, no collapsed stone blocking escape routes. Just silence, smoke, and the strange feeling that someone had left in great haste moments before the Ottoman warriors arrived. Stories quickly spread through the fortress ruins as soldiers carried news of the abandoned armor to nearby units. Some claimed hidden defenders were still moving through tunnels beneath Malta, even after sections of the stronghold had fallen. Others believed the mysterious knight may have escaped by sea during the confusion of the siege. A few older veterans whispered darker theories after nightfall. They believed the fortress had become so consumed by exhaustion, smoke, and fear that men were beginning to lose their sense of reality entirely. But despite the rumors, one detail continued disturbing everyone who entered that corridor. The armor did not feel forgotten. According to later accounts, soldiers passing through the hallway often glanced back toward it instinctively, as if expecting someone to return and reclaim it from the shadows. Even experienced janissaries reportedly avoided touching it after dark. Some claimed they heard movement echoing deeper inside the fortress whenever they lingered near the corridor too long. Others insisted they saw smoke shifting around the armor in unnatural ways whenever nearby fires flared brighter through the ruins. Whether these stories were true or simply the product of exhausted minds trapped too long inside a collapsing battlefield remains impossible to know. But slowly, the abandoned armor stopped feeling like an object left behind during war. It began feeling like evidence of something unfinished, something waiting somewhere deeper inside the burned fortress beyond the reach of firelight and smoke. As the fires continued spreading through the shattered fortress, more Ottoman soldiers began reporting strange experiences inside the ruined corridors. At first, officers dismissed the stories as exhaustion. After all, the siege had pushed everyone beyond normal human limits. Men had survived weeks beneath relentless heat, thunderous artillery, collapsing walls, and constant tension where every shadow might hide danger. Sleep came only in brief moments between bombardments. Smoke burned the eyes day and night. Hunger and dehydration clouded judgment. Under conditions like that, even disciplined soldiers could begin imagining things. But the stories did not stop. They grew. Janissaries assigned to search the damaged interior claimed they heard footsteps echoing through empty hallways long after nearby sections had already been secured. Others reported hearing doors slam somewhere deep inside the fortress, only to discover entire corridors standing completely abandoned when they investigated. One soldier swore he saw movement at the far end of a smoke-filled staircase late at night. He described a figure disappearing around a corner wearing part of a steel breastplate that reflected firelight before vanishing into darkness. Yet when several men searched the area moments later, they found nothing except scorched stone walls and drifting ash. The abandoned armor remained where it had first been discovered, untouched beside the burned corridor. By then, many soldiers actively avoided the area after sunset. Even experienced veterans who had fought across the Mediterranean admitted the fortress felt different from any battlefield they had known before. Malta no longer seemed like a captured stronghold. It felt occupied by memories that refused to disappear. One Ottoman officer later wrote that entering certain parts of the fortress felt like walking through the remains of a world frozen during its final moments. Broken furniture still stood inside smoke-darkened chambers. Half-burned candles rested beside religious icons covered in soot. Armor pieces, maps, shattered weapons, and personal belongings remained scattered throughout the fortress, exactly where they had been left during the chaos of the siege. In some rooms, meals abandoned days earlier still sat untouched beside cold fireplaces. It was this strange stillness that unsettled the Ottoman warriors most. The defenders had resisted for months with extraordinary determination. Yet many signs suggested that during the final hours, entire sections of the fortress had been evacuated in tremendous haste. The mystery surrounding the abandoned armor only deepened those fears. Some janissaries became convinced the missing knight was still somewhere inside the fortress, moving through hidden tunnels beneath the walls. Others believed the defenders intentionally left the armor behind as part of some symbolic act before retreating deeper into Malta. Rumors spread that certain underground passages connected multiple sections of the fortress through ancient escape routes known only to the knights themselves. Searching parties were sent into lower chambers beneath the damaged walls, where smoke collected heavily in narrow passageways carved directly into stone. The deeper the soldiers explored, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. Air inside the underground tunnels felt hot and stale from nearby fires still burning overhead. Water dripped slowly from cracked ceilings, while torchlight revealed strange markings carved into walls blackened by centuries of smoke and candle soot. In several areas, the Ottomans discovered signs that defenders had recently passed through, including discarded cloth, empty water containers, and footprints left in ash-covered floors. Yet no defenders were ever found. It was as though the fortress itself had swallowed them whole. And still, through all the confusion spreading across the ruins, the abandoned armor remained at the center of every story, silent, waiting, almost untouched by the destruction surrounding it, while the siege slowly transformed from a military victory into something far more unsettling inside the minds of the men who survived it. By the final weeks of the siege, the fortress no longer resembled the proud stronghold that had once guarded the Mediterranean. Entire sections had collapsed into smoking ruins beneath constant bombardment. Towers stood cracked open against the sky, while fires continued burning through damaged chambers day and night. Yet despite the destruction, the defenders inside Malta continued resisting with a determination that stunned even the most experienced Ottoman commanders. The deeper Ottoman forces pushed into the shattered stronghold, the more chaotic the situation became for everyone trapped inside. Narrow corridors filled with smoke forced soldiers to move slowly through unfamiliar passageways, where visibility sometimes disappeared completely. Heat from nearby fires turned underground chambers into suffocating ovens. In some areas, stone floors remained so hot from bombardment that men could feel warmth rising through their boots hours after artillery fire had stopped. Supplies were collapsing on both sides. Ottoman soldiers, exhausted by months of siege warfare, struggled to maintain pressure, while defenders inside the fortress faced dwindling food, limited water, and constant exhaustion. Yet neither side seemed willing to surrender control of the fortress completely. During the final assaults, confusion spread rapidly across the battlefield. Small groups of defenders reportedly abandoned heavily damaged sections of the stronghold and withdrew deeper into the interior, while engineers attempted desperate repairs around collapsing walls. Some defenders carried wounded comrades through smoke-filled corridors toward underground chambers beneath the fortress. Others burned supplies and destroyed equipment to prevent them from falling into Ottoman hands. According to later accounts, entire passageways became blocked by rubble and debris as fires spread unpredictably through connected sections of the fortress. It was during this chaos that many historians now believe the mysterious armor may have been abandoned. Several Ottoman soldiers later described hearing movement and distant voices echoing somewhere beneath the fortress long after nearby corridors had already been cleared. One janissary searching lower tunnels claimed he discovered signs of a hurried evacuation through hidden escape routes carved beneath the walls. He reportedly found discarded torches, damaged religious items, and sections of cloth torn from military uniforms scattered along narrow underground paths leading toward the coastline. Yet despite these discoveries, no organized group of defenders was ever located moving through the tunnels. The mystery surrounding the missing knight only deepened as more evidence emerged. Some Ottoman officers became convinced the armor belonged to a commander who removed it during the final hours in order to escape more quickly through confined underground routes. Heavy steel armor designed for open combat would have become a burden inside narrow tunnels filled with smoke and collapsing debris. Others argue the knight may have abandoned the armor intentionally while helping wounded defenders retreat from the burning fortress. But a darker theory slowly spread among exhausted soldiers stationed inside the ruins after nightfall. They believed the knight never escaped at all. According to those stories, The owner of the armor had remained somewhere inside Malta during its final collapse, separated from the retreat during the confusion and fire. What made these rumors more unsettling was the fact that strange sounds continued echoing through the fortress long after major fighting had ended. Ottoman sentries guarding damaged corridors occasionally reported hearing distant footsteps or faint metallic sounds somewhere beyond collapsed walls. Searching parties repeatedly explored lower chambers and underground tunnels, but found only more abandoned supplies, burned rooms, and endless darkness stretching deeper beneath the fortress. Slowly, the victory itself began feeling strangely hollow to many of the men who survived it. They had conquered walls, towers, and battlements after months of brutal effort, yet the fortress still seemed unwilling to release the memories of those who fought there. And through all of it, the abandoned armor remained exactly where it had first been discovered, beside the burned corridor, silent beneath drifting smoke, like the final trace of someone who had vanished into the ruins of Malta forever. When dawn finally rose over Malta after the worst of the fighting had ended, the fortress looked less like a military victory and more like the remains of a civilization consumed by fire. Smoke drifted slowly into the pale morning sky, while shattered towers cast long shadows across ruined courtyards still covered in ash. Ottoman banners now stood above sections of the damaged walls, yet many soldiers walking through the stronghold did not feel triumph. They felt exhaustion. Weeks of siege warfare had drained both body and mind until even victory itself seemed strangely distant. Throughout the fortress, cleanup and recovery efforts began almost immediately. Engineers inspected damaged walls while officers attempted to reorganize units scattered across the battlefield during the chaos of the final assaults. Fires still smoldered beneath collapsed roofs and inside underground chambers where heat remained trapped beneath layers of stone. In several areas, soldiers continued discovering abandoned belongings left behind during the defenders' desperate retreat. Broken shields rested beside burned furniture. Religious icons darkened by smoke remained hanging inside damaged chapels. Half-finished meals, empty water containers, and scattered maps still covered tables inside command rooms hastily abandoned during the final hours. Everywhere the Ottomans looked, the fortress carried signs of sudden collapse, mixed with stubborn resistance that had lasted far longer than anyone expected. Yet despite securing the stronghold, many Ottoman veterans admitted they never truly felt alone inside its walls. Even during daylight, certain sections of the fortress remained unnaturally quiet compared to the rest of the battlefield. Underground chambers beneath the damaged towers continued unsettling the soldiers assigned to search them. Narrow passageways twisted through ancient stone beneath layers of smoke and dust, where torchlight barely reached the walls ahead. In several tunnels, Ottoman scouts discovered evidence that defenders had used these hidden routes extensively during the siege. Footprints remained visible in ash-covered floors. Burned torches and damaged equipment littered narrow corners deep underground. Some passages eventually opened near concealed exits facing the sea, reinforcing theories that surviving defenders may have escaped through hidden routes during the confusion of the final collapse. And still, the abandoned armor remained one of the greatest mysteries left behind inside Malta. By then, stories surrounding the missing knight had spread throughout the Ottoman camp. Some soldiers believed he escaped successfully through underground passages before the fortress fell completely. Others insisted he must have died somewhere beneath the ruins, where fires and collapsing walls prevented his body from ever being found. A few men quietly refused to discuss the matter at all. They simply avoided the burned corridor whenever possible, and warned younger soldiers not to linger there after sunset. According to several accounts recorded years later, the armor stayed untouched for days, despite valuable metal being desperately needed after the siege. Even officers seemed reluctant to disturb it. There was something deeply unsettling about the way it stood waiting in silence beside the scorched wall while smoke drifted endlessly around it. For the Ottoman warriors who survived Malta, the fortress became more than a battlefield. It became a place where exhaustion, fear, fire, and memory had fused together, until the line between reality and imagination no longer felt completely clear. Many soldiers eventually departed the island, carrying stories not just about siege warfare or military victory, but about strange moments hidden inside the ruins after the fighting ended. Stories of footsteps echoing through empty tunnels, of armored figures glimpsed through smoke, of abandoned relics left behind by men who vanished during the final collapse of the fortress. And among all those stories, none endured longer than the silent armor waiting beside the burned corridor deep inside Malta's shattered walls. Years after the siege ended, long after the smoke disappeared from Malta's shattered walls and the surviving soldiers returned home across the Mediterranean, stories about the fortress continued spreading from port to port, like fragments of a nightmare no one could fully explain. Veterans who survived the campaign spoke about the unbearable heat, the endless bombardments, and the brutal struggle for every section of the island. But among those stories, one detail appeared again and again in quiet conversations long after midnight: the abandoned armor inside the burned corridor. According to several Ottoman accounts passed down over time, the armor remained inside the fortress for longer than anyone expected. Some soldiers claimed officers ordered it removed, only for workers to refuse entering the corridor alone after dark. Others insisted the armor vanished entirely sometime after the siege, without any clear explanation. No official record ever confirmed what truly happened to it, and perhaps that uncertainty is what allowed the story to survive for centuries. Historians today still debate what most likely occurred during the final hours inside the fortress. Some believe the mysterious knight escaped through underground tunnels leading toward hidden exits near the coastline. Others argue he probably died somewhere beneath the collapsed sections of Malta, never to be recovered from the ruins. Realistically, exhaustion, smoke, confusion, and darkness could easily have distorted the memories of soldiers already pushed beyond human endurance. Yet even rational explanations fail to answer every detail surrounding the discovery. Why was the armor left standing upright beside the wall, instead of scattered among the destruction surrounding it? Why did the sword remain partly sheathed, as if its owner had no intention of making one final stand? And why did so many different soldiers later describe the exact same feeling when passing through that corridor? The feeling that someone had only just left moments before they arrived. Over time, the fortress itself changed. Damaged walls were rebuilt. Fires faded. New generations walked the same stone corridors without knowing the fear and exhaustion that once filled those halls during the summer of 1565. The Ottoman Empire continued expanding across vast territories, while the Knights Hospitaller survived to fight again elsewhere. Entire kingdoms rose and disappeared after Malta. Empires collapsed. Armies vanished into history. But the memory of that abandoned armor somehow endured longer than the men who fought around it. Perhaps because war leaves behind more than ruins and broken walls. Sometimes it leaves traces of unfinished moments suspended in places where fear, desperation, and survival once collided. Places where objects become witnesses long after the people connected to them are gone. Even now, centuries later, parts of Malta's old fortifications still stand overlooking the Mediterranean Sea. Tourists walk through ancient stone corridors once blackened by smoke from cannon fire. Underground chambers remain hidden beneath sections of the fortress where defenders once moved through darkness, carrying supplies during the siege. And somewhere within those surviving walls, historians believe the burned corridor from the old stories may still exist beneath layers of reconstruction in time. But the greatest mystery was never whether the knight escaped. It was what the Ottoman soldiers believed they felt inside that fortress after the fighting ended. Because hardened warriors who had survived one of the most brutal sieges of their era did not return home speaking about victory. They spoke about silence, about empty corridors that felt occupied, about footsteps echoing through smoke long after the fortress had fallen, and about a suit of abandoned armor waiting alone beside a burned wall, as though its owner had stepped away for only a moment and might return at any time from somewhere deep beneath the ruins of Malta.